talking again with Mitch Steele, formerly of Anheuser Busch, Stone, and New Realm. And we're going to be talking about the transition from AB to Stone. Hi, Mitch.
Yeah.
So
So
how did that come about?
I I was at the time I was working for Anheuser Busch at their Merrimack, New Hampshire brewery. I was running the brew house and fermenting cellar for them. I'd gotten out of the new products gig several years before, and it was 2006, and I was enjoying living in New England. But Anheuser Busch was starting to talk about moving me again, either back to St. Louis or somewhere else, and I had young kids at the time. They were just starting school, and I really didn't want to continue moving around, which is what you have to do at Anheuser-Busch when you're, if you're trying to advance your career, you have to be willing to move. And I was having second thoughts about whether I wanted to keep doing that. I wasn't really looking for work, but Stone had posted a job for a head brewer, and we had just spent a fair amount of time in San Diego and really enjoyed it. And I just sent an application in. I talked to my wife about it, and she said, you should send the application in and see what happens. And so I did. And Steve Wagner, who had founded Stone with Gregg Koch, called me up, and we talked quite a while. And then they flew me out to San Diego. And like I said, I wasn't really looking to leave Anheuser-Busch, but when I got to Stone, and I wasn't sure I was going to do this and if it was a good fit or not. And when I got there, I called my wife and I said, I want this job. This is a great fit for me. And, part of it was not only the beers that they were brewing at Stone, which I had been enjoying for several years already. And they didn't sell in New Hampshire at that time, but they sold in Massachusetts, which was 20 miles away. So anytime I was down in Massachusetts, I'd go to this beer store and buy beers like Stone, and they became favorites of mine. But when I got to Stone and saw the operation, I was pretty impressed. They had just opened a brand new brewery in Escondido, and really what put me over the top with everything that I was seeing there was walking into their warehouse and seeing the beers they were distributing. And they had opened up Stone Distributing a year or two after they had opened Stone, because no distributors in California that already existed would take their beer. In California, you can self-distribute. So they started this company so they could distribute their own beer. And they started carrying a lot of really high-end craft beers. I mean, there was, Russian River was in there, Victory was in there, Avery, um, uh, you know, uh, uh, Port, Lost Abbey were, being carried by Stone. A lot of just wonderful beers. And I realized that this was a company that really believed in the rising tide lifts all boats philosophy, and really wanted craft beer to be a huge success, not just for themselves, but for everybody who was legitimately in it. And Stone had a very unique culture that I came to really enjoy. It was very anti-corporate, so very, very different from Anheuser-Busch, where everything was really buttoned up, and you had to go through layers of approvals and things like that. Stone was definitely not like that. It was very much a best idea wins company. So if you came up with an idea, people listened, and sometimes it got through, sometimes it didn't. But Steve Wagner, one of the favorite people I've ever had to work for. He very early on in my time at Stone, he gave me creative freedom with the beers. Would throw things at me, say, "Hey, I never liked this beer. Can you fix it?" And I'd try, and had some success doing that. I think Gregg was a little more skeptical of me because of my background at Anheuser-Busch, and I don't think he ever really bought into the fact that I was a huge craft beer fan for quite a while. But he tried to trip me up all the time. uh, but there's a lot of good stories about all that kind of stuff. But I think I earned Gregg's respect by making some really, really good beers, and I really had an amazing time at Stone. It was absolutely wonderful, and we did some things that I never thought I'd be able to do. We went to Norway and Scotland and collaboratively brewed with friends over there. I got to write the IPA book because the Brewers Association approached Stone about writing it, and it ended up being my project. Initially it wasn't. It was going to be Steve and me, and Steve had to bow out because Stone was growing so fast, and he was the president of the company, and he really didn't have the bandwidth to be writing a book. But Stone was an incredible experience, and I just loved everything that we brewed there. It was just amazing.
And so you were saying about it was a difference in culture. What about in terms of the equipment and brewing methods? Were they different as well?
Oh, very. Stone was an ale brewery. They had just gotten into some automated equipment, and when I got there, and one of the things I realized is that most of the brewing team had never really worked on automated equipment before. So it was an automated Rolex brew house, and so I was. One of the first things I did at Stone was went through the whole programming logic of that brew house with one of the people from Rolex, and just created kind of a step-by-step guide for what was happening with the brewing process. So, to go from conversion rest to raise to mash off, what needed to happen, what valves needed to be in what positions, what triggers the move from conversion to mash off temperature, what triggers the transfer of the mash to the lauter tun, what kind of conditions need to be set on the equipment, the water volumes, everything else, that, and just really tried to go through all that with the team so that they understood that it wasn't just a video game and you can't just open valves and close valves willy-nilly. I think one of the first things that happened that they still talk about was one of the brewers was having trouble with a water valve that was sticking, and so he manually opened it on the mash tun and completed the mash in, but because he was in manual operation, none of the valves closed afterwards. And so the water kept going into the mash tank, and the mash tank filled, and the mash went up the stack and out on the roof. That was one of the things that made me think, okay, we need to take a step back here and really learn how this system is working. But, as far as the brewing process goes, it was a pretty typical ale brew house. They were using hop pellets. AB went to hop pellets probably about 3 years before I left, 2 to 3 years before I left, which was a big project for AB. But Stone was all hop pellets. They did a lot of their hopping in the whirlpool, which Anheuser Busch didn't do any of. And it was really, and the styles of beers were so different. The fermentation, was a pretty typical conical fermenter ale fermentation. We would ferment and age in the same tank. We'd pull yeast off the tanks for pitching, and then we filtered the beer at Stone. We didn't have a centrifuge that came a year or two later, but the beer was ran through a diatomaceous earth filter. They were using perlite for a number of reasons. One, the former head brewer Lee Chase is vegan and didn't want to use diatomaceous earth, and diatomaceous earth requires a bunch of safety precautions and things, and so they were using volcanic perlite as a filter aid, which worked. And then bottling all their beer, no canning at the time when I got to Stone.
Okay. And so the mashing, was that just a straight single infusion?
It was an upward infusion mash typically. So we'd mash in right below conversion rest, and then we'd raise the temperature with steam to conversion, and then we'd raise the temperature to a mash off temperature to stop conversion. So it was typically, we got into more complex mashing profiles later, but most of the beers at Stone throughout my time there were a two-step upward infusion mash.
Okay. That's interesting. That's very much like the English system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar.
Yeah. So you start the mash off at one temperature, then raise it by a few degrees
Yeah, yeah. So
after
we
20 minutes, half an hour.
Yeah. And then, when we were doing, one of the things I did at Stone was really try to dry out their high alcohol beers because I always thought they were a little on the sweet side. And so we'd start going with longer conversion uh, times and lower temperatures. And then we'd raise to, 100, 165 degrees to stop the conversion before we ran it over to the ladder tun.
And then you'd sparge, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, we'd sparge, and pretty standard laddering protocol.
And what temperature would you sparge at?
Oh, we were at the incoming water was 167. And then we raised it up to 170. At Anheuser Busch, they never wanted to use 170-degree sparge water because they were afraid of leaching tannins out of the malt. But we did some trials at 170, and we got better laddering, and we didn't see any increase in astringency or anything in our beer. So we made the change.
Okay. And so, what were the bulk of the beers that you were brewing when you got to Stone? I would guess quite a lot of IPAs.
Yeah, so they had when I got to Stone, Arrogant Bastard Ale, Stone IPA, and Stone Pale Ale were all around 25% of the total volume. And then the anniversary beer was always an IPA. They did a few special releases every year, an Imperial Stout, the Old Guardian Barley Wine, Double Bastard, and Vertical Epic was the one Belgian beer they were doing. And then the anniversary beer, which was always some type of IPA. So, there was Stone IPA, and then that was, and Ruination IPA were the two big IPAs that Stone was brewing on a consistent basis. As I got on with my time at Stone and we started doing more special releases and collaborations, there were a lot more IPAs that we brewed. But in those first few years, we had we got to do one or two new IPA recipes a year, and it turned into 10 to 15, by the time I left, which was a lot of fun.
Okay. And so, what was the source of the ingredients you were using? Were you still using American base malt?
Yeah, American base malt from some, two or three of the big major malt companies. And then we were using some, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the English maltster we were using.
Crisp?
It was Crisp, yeah. It was Crisp, and then we would use some Belgian malts like Special B and things like that. But the crystal caramel malts and most of the dark malts came from Great Western Malting at the time. And they were probably our biggest supplier when I started there, and then we started diversifying our supply chain a little bit just to protect ourselves. And but yeah, it's it was mostly American, and hops were almost all American. I really don't think we were using much of any other country's hops when I got to Stone. It was all American hops.
And was that constantly changing as new hop varieties became available?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I enjoyed most at Stone was being able to really bring in new hop varieties and trial them. We had a pilot system. We had this also a hop evaluation program where we would take a couple of barrels of Stone IPA right before we dry hop it in the big tank, and we put it into pilot tanks and dry hop it with a new hop variety that we wanted to experiment with. About midway into my time at Stone, we joined the Hop Quality Group and the Hop Research Council, which is part of USA Hops, and we're able to really get involved in the hop industry, which I think brought us in touch with a lot of new hop varieties that we were very early to make beers with, very early in the game. And that was part of the job that I enjoyed most was, running trials on new hop varieties and doing tests and coming out with a beer that used a hop variety that nobody had ever heard of before that was really good.
And what happened to those test brews? Were they sold in the brew pub?
Yeah, typically what we would do is because it was such small volume, we would save them for special events, or we would blend them all together and call it a hop salad IPA. It kind of depended, and sometimes we just served them internally in our, we had a draft system in our lab and just drank them after taste panel.
Were you actually doing hands-on brewing at Stone, or was it more a supervisory role?
Yeah, it was more of a management role. I think when I went to Stone, I wanted to be more hands-on, because at Anheuser Busch it's a union shop. So for 14 years I wasn't brewing hands-on at all. And you had to be a member of the union to turn valves and dump malt and dump hops and anything that's involved with brewing a batch of beer, and we weren't allowed to. And so I was hoping to get back into hands-on brewing. I did a little bit of it early on in my time at Stone, but one of the things, like when I realized the programming of the automated system needed some attention and some education with the team, I realized they had a team of great brewers already. And I could fill my day either brewing beer or trying to make sure that they understood how and what they were doing and the whys of what they were doing. And I talked with Steve Wagner about this. I said, look, I know, you wanted me to brew once a week, and that's fine, but I'm finding that I don't know if I should be doing that. I think I should be trying to get these processes dialed in, and get the brewers trained up on the systems, and really evaluate everything we were doing to try and make it more efficient and more safe. And so that's where I kind of evolved to after about 6 months.
Okay, but you were still developing new recipes all the time.
Oh, the whole time I was there. Yeah, that was a big part of my job.
And were you still home brewing at this time?
I did one home brew when I was at Stone, and then I stopped. I stopped home brewing. We did have a 1 barrel pilot system at Stone that I brewed on a lot. That was fun. The very first black IPAs I was trying to brew, I went through that system, and some other beers that we did some development work on. So that was a lot of fun. And eventually we got a 5 barrel pilot system, but the 1 barrel system served us well for several years.
And how did the black IPA turn out?
Well, the first batches turned out like a hoppy porter. Uh, Gregg was not a fan. Steve wanted it to work, and I finally figured it out. I was using English style dark malts, and I don't know if I was reading about a Schwarzbier or if I had a Schwarzbier, a German dark lager, but I said, oh, that's how to do a black IPA is to use whatever malt they're using. And did a little research and found out about DeHuss black malt from Germany. And I did a batch with that, and that's what took the beer to the right place. And I remember taking the beer up, glasses of the beer up to Steve and Gregg and saying, here, try this, I think we got it. And Gregg, who was the biggest skeptic of the whole project, he didn't want to do it, tasted it and said, okay, I'm sold, let's do it. And that was me going out on a limb with Gregg very early on, and I think that's kind of what put me in a spot where he started to believe in what I was trying to do.
And which is the beer you're most proud of that you came up with while at your time at Stone?
Oh my gosh. Uh, you know, there's so many. Levitation Ale was the one that Steve asked me to reformulate, and we won a gold medal at the GABF after I reformulated that one. That was a big moment for me. The black IPA that became sublimely self-righteous. I know the style came and went, but we were the first brewery to really put that out there on a wide national basis and make that style a thing. And I felt really, really proud about that. Enjoy by IPA was a great concept for a beer, 35-day shelf life. It was one of the best double IPAs I've ever brewed. And then Ruination 10th anniversary, which Ruination and Stone IPA were already being brewed and were great beers when I got there. I didn't do anything to those, but when we decided to do a 10th anniversary of Ruination and do a triple IPA at over 10% alcohol, it turned in one of the best beers we ever brewed. And I remember going into taste panel when it had been processed to bright overnight, and went into taste panel first thing that morning when we got there, called the team in and we tasted the beer. And I remember, one of our brewers, Mike Richmond, said, "Oh boy, this has got the love." And I was like, when you taste a beer that is exactly how you wanted it to taste, and you nailed it, it's you're jumping up and down. You're so excited, and that's where we were with that beer, and also with the Sublimely Self-Righteous Black IPA. So, those were the beers that really meant a lot to me. Delicious IPA was another one. We really struggled with that one, and it's become one of Stone's biggest sellers. But Gregg came into my office, as he did quite frequently, and he said, "Hey, I want you to brew a new IPA. We need a second IPA, a companion to Stone IPA, and we're going to call it Delicious IPA." And my reaction was, "Oh my God, how am I going to deliver a beer that that justifies the name Delicious IPA?" And we really struggled with it. We did a lot of pilot batches, and we had just bought a new hop variety called El Dorado. And I had done a collaboration beer with Alex Noel, who was brewing at Drake's Brewing in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area at the time. And she had some El Dorado too. And so the first time I ever used it was in that collaboration beer, and I tasted it and fell in love with that hop. And so after several trials, it just didn't hit the mark on Delicious IPA. I asked Chris Ketchum, who was our brewer down at Stone Liberty Station, which is a 10-barrel system. And he did a lot of really good work and still does for Stone. I said, "Hey, Chris, can you brew a single hop IPA with El Dorado? Let's just see what this hop really is all about." And he brewed a great beer with it, and that's the beer that became Delicious IPA. And we did a gluten reduced version of that as well, using Clarex enzyme. So my father-in-law, who has gluten intolerance, was able to drink beer again after a long stretch. So he was very happy about that too. So it had a personal win for me as well. So yeah, a lot of beers coming out of Stone. I just really fell in love with what we were doing and had a lot of fun with.
So I'm assuming that creatively it was a much happier time than at Anheuser Busch.
Yeah, very few things got rejected at Stone. We were willing to take risks, and we had this. We knew what Stone beers were supposed to taste like. They were going to be assertive, they were going to be hoppy, they were going to be bitter. If we got too much bitterness than what we originally intended, we that's okay. There were a couple of beers we had to knock it down a little bit, but in general, we were willing to take the risks and make the beer, and we could adjust on the fly if we needed to. So yeah, it was one of those experiences that not that many brewers have, to be able to do that. I really look back at that very fondly. It was a great time in brewing, and a great time for me personally as a brewer.
I mean, I guess as well, it's unusual to get that brewing the quantities that Stone were brewing, because it's not like it was just a couple of thousand barrels a year, was it?
No, it was a lot. When I started at Stone, we did almost 40,000 barrels that first year, and when I left Stone 10 years later, we were almost at 400,000 barrels. We were in constant growth management. It was very difficult
Because I
to manage that.
because I remember when I went out to Escondido, which I guess must have been 2014, 2014, I think. I
Mhm.
remember they were just building a new brew house next to the existing one.
Yeah, yeah. And squeezing that in, and it was a tough project. I wanted to put them in parallel, and there was no way to do that with the way the building was laid out. And but yeah, we doubled our capacity. We built a new cellar at that time. We built a whole new building that had the bright cellar and all the packaging, and moved all that part of the operation down the hill a little bit. And we had a tunnel that we built that had piping that we sent the beer down in. And it was quite a growth spurt that we had. It was amazing.
So your next move, which was to New Realm,
Mm-hmm.
what spurred you to do that?
Well, there were a few things going on. Number one, I wasn't looking for work. I was still really happy at Stone. I will say that with us building Richmond and Berlin, and me traveling as much as I was starting to burn out a little bit. And just became, I think the job was becoming more than one person could handle. And we did get some help in, and had a lot of help, but I was still just being pulled all over the place. And so I was getting exhausted. But that really wasn't, these guys that approached me were starting this company. They were both former Anheuser Busch salespeople, and they wanted to start something in the Southeast, and they wanted to make something fairly special and unique. And they had this idea of doing, 20, 10,000 barrel a year breweries in different parts of the Southeast and build a brand that was very regional and very local. And I had never really built a brand from the ground up before, or built a brewery and a brewing process from the ground up before. And that was, and I was thinking to myself, that was the one piece of my experience that I hadn't really had. And so the job intrigued me a bit. And I really wrestled with the idea. And I think one of the things that really sold me on it was the idea of headquartering the company in Asheville, North Carolina, which I've fallen in love with that city. And that turned out not to happen after I accepted the job. The deal for the building fell through, and we ended up in Atlanta, which was a good thing. I like living in Atlanta, but we wanted to brew a wider range of styles of beer, which also was kind of nice, being able to brew an authentic Pilsner and some beers like that. So I joined New Realm, and I was really nervous about it. I was really afraid I was making a mistake, because I had such amazing time at Stone, but I also knew I'd regret it if I didn't try it. And so that's kind of how it all came about.
And so, what sort of beers did you start off brewing there? You say you were trying to build a brand.
Yeah, we had a West Coast IPA, a double IPA, we had a Pilsner, we had a pale ale, we had a porter, we had a coffee porter. We tried to start off with some standard styles and see what was going to work. It was a challenge, because uh, the West Coast IPA made uh, in a similar camp as Stone IPA. I mean, it was 70 IBUs. It used some Centennial hops. Stone IPA was almost all Centennial hops, but we use Simcoe in ours and Centennial. And the feedback we got from not necessarily the craft beer drinkers in Atlanta, but the people that were coming into our tap room, which were younger people, and our distributors, was that the IPA was far too bitter. And so was our Pilsner. And, it was just like, it's like, guys, I've been brewing bitter beers for the last 10 years. There is a market for these, you got to give them time. And yeah, but we ended up adjusting the recipes on those. And then we started doing a lot of different beers. We had a pilot system we were able to play around with. We did our team really wanted a hazy IPA, and I had never brewed one, because hazy IPAs really took off in my last year or two at Stone, and then the year and a half I was not brewing while we were planning and building out the brewery. So I didn't know how to make a hazy IPA. So I had to learn. And, I talked to a lot of folks that were making them, who were very helpful. And I, we did several pilot batches, and we came out with a beer, several test batches first, and then we came out with a beer that was called Hazy Like a Fox, and that became our number one beer, and that still is New Realm's number one beer. And I think I did a pretty good job with it. It wasn't as aggressive as some of the hazy IPAs that are out there. It's probably, a little more drinkable, but it worked. It had a good juicy character. It had a good hop flavor. It had mid-level bitterness, and it was a nice beer. But yeah, it's and I tried to stay on top of things and be very early to market with new styles. And I found it was a harder go at New Realm to get those beers get people excited about those beers than it ever was at Stone. So, that was one of the challenges I dealt with at New Realm. It's like being the first to brew a brewed IPA or a cold IPA didn't get people excited the way it did at Stone. And that was hard.
Do you think that was just down to where you were located?
I think that was part of it. I also think it was due to our relationship with our wholesaler and what they were interested in. And it's Stone. We handpicked our wholesalers and made sure they knew what we were all about and what we were going to be doing. Also related to the fact that wholesalers were trimming their product lines and didn't want a lot of new stuff. And that is something that is still happening to this day. And also, I think the people I worked with weren't that into it, weren't as into it as I was. And, that plays a role as well, so I, tried to brew beers that our sales team was asking for. And, and we came up with some nice beers. I got to brew some really classic, we brewed a nice Vienna lager. We brewed, a really good gold nail that we partnered with a couple of universities on. We did several IPAs and several hazy IPAs. We had a series of experimental hazy IPAs that was a lot of fun for several years. So, we had our fun. It just wasn't, I wasn't able to brew the assertive, boldly hop beers in the same way I did at Stone. And so I had to make some adjustments. But I had fun, with the creative process and brewing the beers we were brewing. We did a lot of really nice beers.
Okay, and so now you've moved on from there, and you're
Mm-hmm.
saying that you're more doing consulting now.
Yes. I am looking for work. I'm still an advisor at New Realm, so they can pick up the phone and call me anytime, and I'll help them out if they're having a problem with something or need some history on what we were doing with a certain situation or whatever. So that's still part of my gig. But I started a consulting company. I've got 2 or 3 people I'm working with right now, and setting up consulting visits with them over the next couple of months. We'll see where that goes, and then I'm also looking for work. I would like to do a project where I get a beer brewed in the UK and get it sold in the UK, and I'm talking to some people I know in England about that.
Okay,
Um, I'd love to be able to do that. Love to be able to work with brewers and help them get better at what they do. And I'm also looking for a full-time job, if because consulting's uh, it's very difficult to sustain business in today's brewing environment. I've got a few people knocking at my door now, and I really want to work with them, and I'm looking forward to doing it, but I just don't know if it's a long-term solution for me. So yeah, I'd like to find a brewery and get back into being a strategic level leader in a brewery. I think that's where at this point in my career, I'm a best fit, and we'll see what happens.
okay. Well, thank you very much, Mitch, for speaking to me. I think it's some very interesting stuff there, especially the technical details. I think people like that.
Yeah,
So, well, thank you again, and hopefully we'll get to meet up again soon.
I hope so, Ron. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.